off as contradictions. We are here to play in that realm of contradiction and cognitive dissonance. We are here to infect your mind.
I don't have any plans or a roadmap for this, other than the little bit that we talked about beforehand.
I was just going to ask, where do you want to start? How do we want to tackle this? Because when I start to wrap my mind around something, you can just feel that there's so many different places and things and different ways to look at it that it's such a good topic that it's like, what can we spend the most time on? What's worth spending the most time on? I was obviously interested in like the sort of mind part, or like the act of thinking about history, very basically.
Okay. Well, let's start there. And with that, let's start here. Tell me what it is that either interested you or the thought process that you had when you thought about thinking about history, the metacognition of history.
The biggest thing is like what people were doing and how that compares to today and why that's interesting. And for like my personal experience, I end up reading half of a lot of nonfiction books where I'm like, okay, I get the gist and move on. Still time well spent, I think, even though I don't finish them. But I enjoy like deep dives into one specific topic. Like recently I was learning all about Assyria and like the Assyrian king list and a bunch of stuff that is like, I really had never heard of that in my life. And part of the book that I was reading was about how Victorians in England were very obsessed with Assyria, and they, people could list every king on the list and they knew all the history and they were doing archaeology, and it was a really popular topic and a big hobby for a lot of people. Kind of similar to like the Roman Empire today, where, that was a meme for a while. Assyria was the exact same way. And how it seems like that kind of changes or trends with what we're interested in learning about. And that got me thinking about, why am I currently interested in Assyria? What draws people to it? And then what makes people put it down and move on to the next thing?
Okay, there's a bunch there to extrapolate. Are you talking interest in Assyria specifically as what draws people, or just what draws people to other cultures and civilizations in the past? Because those are two different questions.
I agree. Yeah. I was thinking more generally what draws people to different things in the past, because I think like the reason why Assyria is very interesting is because it's like one of the first giant cultures that had huge temples and like an infrastructure, and the like palaces were gigantic and things that we think weren't possible back then. So I think because it's so old and was pretty advanced for its time is why people are interested in Assyria. Like, how does that happen? But in general, some people, I guess it is, we usually are, well, that's sort of a chicken and the egg. Are we more interested in the very advanced, like the buildings that we have left, or because the buildings are left, or are we interested because the writings that are left? I think that's probably true. The evidence that we have is what makes it more interesting.
I think it's cosmopolitan. It's a blend of them. The megalithic structures are impressive in and of themselves, hence why people still go to Stonehenge, right? The writings of the cultures that created the megalithic structures that we can use to better understand why it is they built them, cultural carrots and sticks, what was incentivized and why that resulted in these megalithic structures for whatever purposes. And that's something that we don't have with Stonehenge. Famously, a lot of the Celtic and Druidic peoples in Central, Mid, and Western Europe notoriously didn't write anything down.
I do think the part of the pull of Stonehenge is that it's mysterious. We don't know anything about the people who built it, how many people built it, who and why they built it. Obviously, we have a pretty good idea, but it's all guesswork and could be, one piece of evidence could change everything.
And I think that is part of the pull to civilizations in other times and places and contexts than our own. That mystique born from novelty. Right? It's something different. Yes, it's in the past and it's old, but it's still something new. It's not how we understand or express ourselves in the world today. There's in fact, there's a lot of different points in history that we can look at that have similar settings and situations to the past as novelty. And, let me just say this. I'll go through them in order because I got a couple in my head. The first one is a story about Xenophon, an Ionian Greek that fought for the Persians or against the Persians, something along those lines. He participated somewhere. Going to get the stories wrong on all of these, but the essential point is going to be the same. And in one of his writings or one of his works that's come down to us, he tells us a story about how him and his Greeks were fleeing across the Persian desert, and they came across the ruins of Assyrian and Sumerian and pre-Persian cities with walls and structures that were impossibly big. And most of his writing, the tone is spent in just awe of what sorts of giants or masters of men could create such constructions, right? Then we have collapse of the Western Roman Empire, circa early 400s AD, right? The next, it's part of what allowed there to be a rise in a Viking age about 300 or 400 years later, is because all of that quote unquote civilized culture eroded away back to more quote unquote primitive cultures, where much of the stories of England or France or Germany from about 500 to 700 are about these peoples that are living in and around places and using technologies that they don't know how to recreate. The Roman aqueducts, the Roman roads, the Roman forums and galas and heated baths and all of those things that their current cultures were incapable of recreating. And it's, again, like Xenophon is them looking to the past as this, for lack of better terms, great civilization. And then we have another example. We can look at the Renaissance, starting in Italy, right? That reintroduction of all of the classical, or what we would consider the classical philosophies in artworks, thanks to Persians. And that reintroduction back into the European milieu spurred I don't think reverence is too strong of a word, of reverence for the knowledges, philosophies, and technologies of the past. Right. So I think it's part of the human condition to look back at how our ancestors did things that we can do so easily today and took so much effort. And we think, why would someone expend that much energy to do these things? But it's also part of the human condition to, well, as they say, never underestimate the power of human ingenuity.
I think the reverence for the past culture is very interesting, because that's also exactly what we're doing and talking about. And it always blows my mind to think about, in my mind, like historical people learning about history as well. I'm like, why are you doing that? You're living it. What? Focus on the present.
And I think that is something that we as a people struggle to really comprehend. For example, the Egyptian empire, culture, whatever you want to call it, is kind of both of those things in various different ways. It lasted for, depending on if you want to split hairs, 3, 4, close to 5,000 years. Right? King Narmer was one of the first pharaohs that started uniting the Egyptian lands right around and shortly after the time that early hieroglyphic was being formed. Archaeologists have found evidence that some of the earliest writing in the Egyptian areas are the symbols for the different nomes, Nome. It's like counties in the area. And so we have tax revenues to thank for giving us writing, as an infrastructure started to form around that to keep track of who owed who what and who it was to be paid to and why. And those were all tied with local chieftain allegiances. And that started happening 4,000 BC, 3,500 BC, something like that. And then it extends all the way until Cleopatra, more or less.
So I think we could definitely say that an interest in history and the cultures that came before us has always been interesting. And even if it's taxes, people translate it and want to learn about it. And like, wow, this one receipt can teach us so much. And that's so boring. Like, if you remove how cool it is to see something that old, but it's still super interesting.
Well, it's like the earliest customer complaint from
yeah,
an Assyrian or a Persian about the subpar copper that he was getting from that dude. And I love it because, two things. It's important to remember, going back to your people living through history, studying history, the reason why I brought up how long the Egyptian empire and an unbroken cultural transmission is because at various points through that, you have ancient Egyptian historians, people living in ancient Egypt, studying even more ancient Egypt. That's part of the Xenophon story. It's fascinating to think that this was the old world, and the people at the time knew that it was the old world.
And I get a little frustrated when I think about all of the evidence and things that were destroyed, or in Athens, they take all of the stones from one of the temples, like Zeus's temple. All of the stones were removed and used for something else. And it's really frustrating as a person today. Why did they do that? How could they have destroyed this? It's so cool. And then I'm thinking today, a tweet that I keep seeing is that woman who recorded every second of television for 50 years on VHS. And that's the only copy of that part of television. And so it's tough for me to empathize with taking down Zeus's temple in Athens, this gigantic Olympian. It's huge. And must have been a lot of work to do that. Just leave it so I could see it today. Very selfish of me. But at the same time, we are purposely destroying and purging our own history constantly because it's not important to us. And, we need to destroy X so we can build Y. And, this plot of land had an 1830s house, and now it's got a 2024 ultra modern house. And the kind of living through it only, and we're definitely feeling that these days with like internet archival efforts, and realizing that a big part of our like internet history is gone because the servers go down, and that's that. So recently there's been more like digital efforts to preserve things digitally so that we can look back at the internet and see what it was like. But that didn't happen until we started to lose it, which I think is good. But also, like, I'm like, why bother? Why do I need to see this 2008 website? But then in 80 years from now, people will be really frustrated that we, deleted everything. So at the same time that there's like this reverence for history, there is not necessarily the same sentiment to the things today, I think, for most people.
And I think if we take that one step further and explore there a little bit, we'll get to something juicy, because it's not just curiosity and information and the desire to save that. It's also the crafting of our understandings and conclusions from that information. So, perfect example of take down, reuse, replace, whatever, statues. Old Confederate statues are being taken down because revisionist historians are, quote unquote, rewriting history from this different perspective to have different layers of value and meaning on these things, right? And this is not an argument or a discussion about whether the revisionist historians are correct or incorrect on that point. It's merely an observation that we as the human species are participating in this the same way that the ancients did as well, right? Why were there ancient Egyptian historians in ancient Egypt? Well, because they were trying to understand and write the story, their historical story as they understood it, for their own ends. And I don't mean that in the cynical, shrewd businessman getting ahead of everything at the expenditure of everything, but so that way the story they told about themselves and to their children had continuity and matched with how they understood their place in the world in their time as they looked back 1,000 years or 2,000 years prior.
So, right, thinking of or a lot of people, I think, view the Renaissance as sort of the hinge for the Western world becoming good and improving and making life better, creating art and doing things that are worthwhile, when we know that that's just a sentiment. That's people are people have been peopling forever, and we definitely use that as the turning point for Europe and society, and saying this was a dark age and now we're better, and kind of having that plot line of and we've been going up ever since. And I think for in most people's minds, that probably ends with industrialization is the next hinge, right? And then digitization is the next hinge after that, where we're going up and we're going up and we're going up. And is if I'm not able to do this, but I'm wondering if objectively looking at the Renaissance as something that was kind of detrimental to culture, or can we even have that perspective? We obviously don't, but we have that perspective not because that's objectively true, but because that what works for our values today. Are there people who say that was bad?
I don't know about that, but I do want to go back and revisit the images we used about historical peoples looking back at their own history as being better, right? So the Franks and the Angles and the Saxons in the 500s or 600s AD, we have an built-in bias to look at their cultural conditions and compare them to cultural conditions within the Roman Republic or the Roman Empire 300 or 400 years prior and say that that's a downgrade because we are the inheritors of cultural and technological quote-unquote advancements, which most graphs would chart like it's hockey stick shaped, and the hockey stick curves, I would agree, hinges around the Renaissance, right? That resurgence in exploring art and science, proto-science, if we want to call it that, and beginning to separate those things out from religion. And I don't mean detach, because I don't think that's possible. We have to remember Isaac Newton went to church every Sunday. The Enlightenment arose out of the quagmire of the Reformation and has so much religious undertones fueling it that I don't think those two are to be separated, but to even have the concept that science and religion can differ, and that's okay. In fact, and oftentimes they should, is important, and a lot of that starts in the Renaissance, or at least the seeds of that thinking were sowed there. And it's easy for people like us that live in a technologically quote-unquote advanced society today compared to most historical eras to see that as signs of betterness and to default to that, right? When it's just as true that you look at the Celtic peoples or the Franks or the Angles. England is a perfect example. After the fall of the Roman Empire, these people may have not had the state as a stabilizing force, but what they had in replacement for that was utter freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Which might have been a tilt too far in the other direction as opposed to the very state-heavy stability of the Roman Empire, right? Which is why we kind of nestle back into feudal times during the Middle Ages leading up to the Renaissance, right? We kind of baseline back. But yeah, I think it goes both ways.
I was actually thinking today while I was driving, and this is going to sound like a tangent, but I'll bring it home, that like very expensive, like luxury things have like more 5-star reviews in people's minds. I was specifically thinking of Disney World, that a lot of people say, this is the best, it's the best vacation, it's so great, because it's so expensive and you're having to justify what you just paid to yourself and say it's pretty good, can't really complain, so it's a 5 out of 5. Because if I say like, oh, that was a 4 out of 5, but I paid that much, you're sort of contradicting. We're not able to do that. And you're much more likely, if you pay a ton of money and invest a bunch of time and you go and stay at this really nice place and eat all this really expensive food, that you have to give it a good review afterwards. Because if you admit that it's kind of mid, that you don't like it that much, then it feels like a waste of money. And that's really hard to sit with, and to sleep at night knowing that you did that. And so you can almost trust like cheaper things, the reviews a little bit more than you could like a Michelin star restaurant that's like $300, because people who go have to say it's good because they just spent that much time and money. And I can see that sentiment and that urge. I was just kind of contemplating that urge today and how that would apply to living in today's society. Like, we're already here. There's nothing we can do about it. So we have to have a good review. Otherwise, like, how do you sleep at night? How do you go to work every day? If you don't say like, this is better, we're moving, like there's things that we can change, but this is definitely better and it could be worse, and we're moving in the right direction. And that's probably been a sentiment, forever, is to have that glass half full mentality, because how would you go on if you were being very, very objective for everything? And I think we all know those people. They're like wet blankets who were like, it was all right. And it's frustrating because you're like, it was perfect. And it, even though, there's different things going into that opinion. And when with history, like, it's solid, it's there. So, like, do we say, wow, the Roman Empire was really cool because, like, objectively it was awesome? Or is it like, it's there, we can study it, you just read a whole book on it. So do you say, this is great, this was a good use of my time, it's very interesting? So kind of like the sunk cost fallacy with our perception of today and our perception of the past and the things that we care to learn about. Because I don't think anyone like reads a book out of hate. It's always interest or something that you like, right? And have that tendency to maybe be overly positive.
I have two things on that, and I'm not entirely sure I'm going to remember both of them and be able to come back. So if I say firstly and I don't come back to it secondly, don't hold me to account. Firstly, we have to ask the question, what do we mean by great? Because the Roman Empire, if we're just using that as an example, destroyed the lives of millions of people.
Right.
Like
paganism was gone. We lost so many like niche gods and niche religions that would have been really interesting.
And even before that time, just Julius Caesar's invasion of Gaul, modern day France, I want to say by the time he was done, a third of the population was killed and another third of the population was sold into slavery. Population was estimated at about 6 million, between 3 to 6 million. So if we take the low end of that, about 3 million people living in Gaul, 1 million of them were killed after his conquest over 5 to 10 years. Thumbs up. Thank you, Skype. And another 1 million of them were sold into slavery. That population deficit is almost enough to cause a population collapse.
That is not insignificant.
Right. And so, what do we mean by great? And I was thinking about this earlier, that part of what interests people in history, I think, is that inherent desire to see great people. Right. And maybe this might be a hinge point where we can start tying it into ego and stuff like that, because I do want to talk about that a little bit too. We might have to tease a little bit and then do that as a second part. But by great people, I don't mean moral per se. Julius Caesar was a great man. He accomplished a lot of things. He was head of state in the largest state-sponsored infrastructure in the Western world at the time. I think the only real competitors for them at the time were the Chinese, right? Adolf Hitler was a great man. He wasn't a good man. He was evil. But if you look at what he accomplished with what he had coming out of World War I, he accomplished a lot. They were terrible things to accomplish. Right? I know, just to be clear, in no way, shape, or form endorse that position at all. But if we look at people that single-handedly are responsible for the highest body count on Earth, he's up there in the top 10, probably top 5, probably close to the top 1, right? If that doesn't qualify as being good at something, I don't know what does.
He has a Time magazine cover.
Right. And so this is where I'm going with that now. And I bring those two people up specifically, Julius Caesar, because in order to do the things that we look back and read with interest in and try to envision ourselves there, was paved with blood. And Hitler the same way, but kind of like the polar opposite. I don't think many people read anything and like, what, it'd be cool to be his right-hand man for a little bit. Whereas we read books about Caesar and we're like, if I could be in a blimp for a day, I'd like to be there. what I think we do as people is we take those greats and then we align them along a spectrum of morality to add that moral component to that, right? And as you were talking about the sunken cost fallacy, all I could think about was I think it was Kant, the Critique of Reason, where we can't rely on pure logic alone, because pure logic alone, it's kind of like the science religion dilemma. Pure logic alone doesn't give us meaning or conclusions or anything like that. Pure logic alone is how we say Julius Caesar was a great man because he accomplished a lot. We look at these objective qualia and criteria that say he did this more than anybody else.
I do think, like, from a moral perspective where we consider ourselves more advanced and beyond what Julius Caesar was working with as far as like education and, knowledge in general. And it's easier to forgive and to engage with the horrible things that he went for because we're not necessarily afraid of that happening again in comparison to World War II, where everyone is constantly like, World War III, we're very touchy, and it's a little bit scary because we are not that far removed and we do not consider ourselves particularly more advanced than, the 1950s. It's too soon. So it feels safe to say, like, wow, I want to learn more about the tactics that they use to, provide the infrastructure. How do you feed 1 million slaves? How do you, organize that? Who was in charge? And to learn about that in a way that it feels safer than to, be really interested in the train systems that they set up and like, who was, making the schedule for the trains that took people to concentration camps. No one is, I guess people are kind of learning about that, but, the perspective and the way that we talk about that is very different, I think, because of that element of like, we don't need to worry about doing that again, even though we just said they're kind of really similar events and they're not, we consider them very differently just because of their difference in time and like the tactics of war.
The only reason I'm holding this one up is just because it's in arm's reach and I wanted to use it as an example. But speaking of the people don't read against something they read because they're interested in, I have at least 3 or 4 books on the type of conditions that created the type of people that allowed World War II atrocities to happen. The one I just held up was Ordinary Men. It's about a police brigade, battalion, whatever the term is, in Poland, and how it wasn't the super indoctrinated SS elite that were on the ground doing the day-to-day stuff. It was quote unquote ordinary people, right? Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago is another one, but that's more of from the Russian perspective. I have a book called Hitler's Furies that is about the wives of the military elite that moved into Poland, the Lebensraum, the living room that Hitler annexed and created for the elite, and how they went along with the atrocities that were happening. It's why there's so many books written on Marxism and communism and fascism and political ideology. I think there is just because we recognize that we aren't that different from the people 2 generations ago, that did these things that drives that interest, not for the sake of pure logic and understanding, but for the sake of where did it go wrong? How can we put those barriers back up? Right? What is it that the old saying is, those that don't study history are doomed to repeat it, right? And I think a lot of that is because, well, two things. Firstly, a lot of it is because history is how we understand ourselves, where we came from. Why do we have predispositions, not guarantees, but predispositions towards certain cultural values over others? Well, there's a 250-year history just scratching the surface of the creation of an American culture, which is the one that I was born in, which is what shaped and bounded, not preset and determined, but shaped and bounded the ways that I would lean towards some values and ideals. The other thing that we have to remember is we have to keep in mind that history isn't a thing. History is the story that we tell ourselves about the things. We have a historical event. We have a historical location. We have an historical object, right? Zeus's temple, the Colosseum in Rome, things like that. The history of those things, of those events, are derived from our subjective interactions with those objective pieces. Regardless of how I feel about it, the Colosseum is there. I've seen it. We've touched it. Right? Now, what does that mean? How should we feel about it? That's the history. So what we do when we study history, the technical term is historiography, is when I'm reading a book written by a different historian, I'm reading that historian's interpretation of this historical event and the people involved. And a good historian will tell you that A, that's the case, and B, the ways that they predict it might have influenced their understanding of the thing. Right? Like I mentioned earlier, our bias to thinking that state-sponsored stability, and I can hear the libertarians reeing, but state-sponsored stability and technological advancement is good because that's what we're enmeshed in, right? It very well could be. I mean, using logic, all of the objective measurements suggest that human flourishing is at the highest that it's ever been in human history, right? But it kind of depends on how we define good. So, no, you can go ahead.
Oh, I was definitely thinking of how we define good, because the thing that's been on my mind just with like some recent trainings is like the obesity epidemic, or like, we won't know what we're doing here with like food and exercise as Americans until a couple decades from now, because it's quite the controversial thing. But, are we doing better from, like a nutrition and food perspective than we were in the 50s, and we were in 1910, and we were in 1810, when you consider the like health and wellness and the well-being and the abilities of people. This is very American centric, this like obesity epidemic, obviously, but having different metrics, I think always asking ourselves, like, by what standard is a very good practice, because we can say, we're doing much better than people were prehistory, but also we have a lot going on that we can't look at ourselves until we have a little bit more data on. It took a really long time for scientists to like finally get to the point where like smoking is bad. And today that seems like the easiest like health thing to say, which is like, yeah, smoking is pretty bad for you, but look at how long it took for us to get there. It's going to be the same thing with pretty much all of the new diseases that people are studying today. And having the we can look back and say, like, well, we don't have the bubonic plague, so that's way better. But we literally just had COVID, so are we doing that much better? It feels like sort of a moot point for us to say, like, this is much, much better, because I don't think that we can actually know until everyone who's alive today is dead. And then we can kind of look and see how 2024 actually was, right?
Right. And that's what I was going to say on that. Well, a couple things. Firstly, more people have access to more food today than at just about any other point in history. I don't have the numbers in front of me, so I'm just kind of spitballing here. But it is remarkable that the amount of people on the planet that can go down to a supermarket and exchange their labor batteries. That's how I view money. It's a battery for your labor. Exchange their labor batteries for food, right? So they give the battery to someone else that has expended that labor to grow and produce that food. So you don't have to grow and produce that food, right? It's exchanging. We also know that life expectancy is longer in almost every place on the planet than it ever has been in human history. However, much of that extended life is thanks in part to modern medicine to be able to handle things like if the bubonic plague arose again, we have medication for it. If smallpox comes back around, we can treat it. Smallpox is viral, so it gets a little bit trickier there. But the point is, like, that's part of the reason why people are living longer. But the quality of our food, at least in industrialized nations, has gone down. I'd be willing to bet money, and I might lose this bet because I'm not a betting man, so I don't ever typically bet. I just say I'm willing to bet that diabetes is, at least in the United States, fairly high compared to just about any other historical time that you can look at, right?
Yeah, like, will we in 100 years look back at diabetes the same way that we now look at like malnutrition and famine, which even those are not very common. Like, people were like living pretty hard, but like a legitimate famine didn't happen all the time. Despite like thinking about the Middle Ages and people, begging for alms, it's relatively fine. Something, 100 years in a row had to go wrong before people were really, really struggling. So having like, will we look back at diabetes in that same way and say like, wow, this could have changed. They could have done this. They could have, how did we get here? And we won't know. But we do. I mean, the one thing that we have going for us is that we do have a lot more ability to treat things. Like specifically diabetes, we already have a ton of medications that can help. So are we going to be able, or how long can we stay ahead of our own problems that we're creating as a society with our society? I think we have that going for us a little bit better than they did, back before medicine was something that was helpful and not something that just led you to like blood loss and dehydration. And so I lost my second train of thought, but we're able to fix our own problems a little bit more, I think.
And this brings me to my second thought, which was it's almost like a cruel twist of fate that things occur in this way. Just like you're saying about diabetes, just like you're saying about the data necessary to treat things better, for lack of better terms, coming too late for the current generation, right? It helps inform the next generation, which is a net positive. We do the same thing with education. We do the same thing with parenting. I was thinking about this rather deeply the other day, that I am going to get the evidence that I parented either appropriately or inappropriately when it's too late to make any changes about it. When my children are adults in their mid-30s and they're finally getting a good, healthy grasp of who they are and how they understand themselves to be, the damage will already have been done. I just have to, as a parent and as a former educator, it's just the same thing. When we try to implement a new way to teach this topic, or a new activity to use with this topic, or a new set of standards or something like that, the next year or two's results in quantitative data, test scores, pass fail rate, etc., graduation rate, the next couple of years isn't true to the implementation of those changes. Right, because you're having kids that still have the old system and they're just kind of in the in between. It's not going to be until we get a generation down the road that we realize that this was a good or a bad thing. Right?
Yeah.
Right. It takes, as macabre as this is going to sound, it takes messing with people to understand how to not mess with people so much.
Yeah. I think that's true with, like, I mean, it's sort of like a meme that, like, iPad kids are entering middle school, like that age, and the
Gen Alpha.
yeah, those people who were raised by iPads, who have never sat and made eye contact at a dinner table in their entire life because they've always just been handed the iPad and told to shut up. Like, what will, and that's obviously like a big stereotype. Like you said, we won't know what the effects of that are. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe they'll be fine. I have no idea. So having like this expectation, well, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for Gen Alpha to be like twitchy, low attention span, like low skill level, high, just like bye addicts for their lives. And when you're looking for that, you will definitely find it. And so now, like, there's a much bigger push to limiting screen time for children, and like they'll never have sugar. And obviously this is just like the again, a stereotype, probably not actually true for the most part, but you do see these trends. And we're able to judge people pretty efficiently with our like internet, and like the need to post a video and that you get feedback on that you weren't looking for, but you posted the video. So I think I am expecting that cycle of like changing our ways or having a new trend, it is speeding up. It's getting faster and faster because we're able to reflect so much sooner and so much more deeply. And you really don't have any choice but to reflect when we are looking at each other so much. There's so much sharing, there's so much communication compared to before the digital age. So having your like opinion, how to do it, what's the right way, it's very solid, but also constantly changing with what you're told. And it does take a special, I think, what I think media literacy is the term that people are using to kind of describe being able to look at the internet without it like rotting your brain, that type of thing. So these cycles are going so much faster and faster compared to the past. But no buts. I think that's actually true.
And I think that that is very similar to, how do I want to say this? I'm going to play off an assumption here. I assume that you've designed a psychological study, maybe to some small scale, not like a big nationwide study or whatever, but I assume that it's part of the formal training and education that you've had in your degrees in psychology, right? I think the fact that we can be more reflective in a more responsive manner is the same as telling your study subjects what you're looking for in the study while they're being studied, right? I think that it is skewing the results of the data. And I don't mean skewing as in like messing with statistics to make it say what you want to say. I mean skewing the results as in when we have Gen Alpha or Gen Z reflect upon their experiences for us to have more data, that in turn is changing their experiences because they're reflecting on them in a certain type of way, whether intentional or unintentional. And that is, I do agree there is a snowball effect, but I think that is kind of determining the direction of the snowball effect, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like a constant placebo effect, or the effect of being observed. We are feeling that constantly. Like we get, 3 years ago, you posted this on Facebook, and we're constantly having that assessment of ourselves in the past to today, and being able to reflect on that and change based on the data before the data really even has time to actually become data in science.
Which is interesting because isn't that how a lot of pathologies start? Here's where I'm going with that. Being conscious is one thing, and we think that that is a good thing. We are aware of our surroundings. We are aware of reality. We can interface with reality, quote unquote, appropriately, right? Being self-conscious, on the other hand, we view that as a bad thing. Being too aware of yourself, being too observant of yourself. Most pathologies, okay, maybe not most, a decent number of pathologies stem from somebody paying too much attention or hyper-focusing too much on a certain part of their lives and pathologizing it. Anorexia, OCD, anxiety disorders, depression. Yes, there's neurochemical causes for a lot of those things, but there's also cognitive causes for a lot of those things. And a lot of those cognitive causes come from ruminating on one's own experiences in such a way as to magnify the negative aspects of those experiences.
Yes. I think that the cognitive side of mental illness does get overshadowed a lot because it is really difficult and not good, not productive to tell someone who's not feeling well mentally that you're doing this to yourself. Like, that's never a place to start, like, having a place of empathy. But it is true that, like, losing your job can cause depression. Having like an injury can cause depression, and it's these environmental things and the way that we reflect about them. And it's not their fault, but it is a huge factor that does have to be addressed in recovery and like feeling better, and that self-reflection without blame, which I just reiterate because it's impossible. You can't talk to someone about it. Part of my job, I can't tell people like, this is your fault, but I have to reflect that very gently. So I'm saying it very bluntly here.
Well, because I think to some degree we all know that that is the case. And I don't mean to say that the person that is dabbling with depression because they keep thinking about negative aspects of their lives, like I'm not going to say that they should be blamed per se. But for that person, I think all of us, when we're in that position, recognize that yes, that is the case. If I could view myself differently, I would be feeling differently. Therefore, it is within my control, and therefore it is my fault, so to speak. And I say that dispassionately, right? That's no value judgment placed on that, because we're all humans and that's what happens. But the point I'm trying to make with this is, well, two things. First of all, again, that we're kind of tiptoeing around the ego piece, which I'd love to sit down and just get a working definition for that, because I know when people say ego, if anybody has put any thought into it, the first thing that pops up with is Freud. And I'm going to borrow some of his terms, but I'm not thinking about ego in the same framework that he was, right? I'm thinking about it in a different thing. But also too, that what is your life experience but being the eternal observer for your experience, right? And if quantum mechanics has anything to say about it, which it kind of feels like it does, having an observer in an experience changes the metaphysics of that experience. We are always having our experience meddled with by being our own observer, right? I think that's where the self-conscious becoming a bad thing emanates from, if that makes sense.
And that's also the only way to fix it. Like a non-self-aware person can't like defeat their mental illness. It does take a level of self-awareness and figuring it out. And, you know, with just like regression to the mean, no matter what you do, the depressive episode will end eventually. No one has ever lasts forever, except those very rare cases where there's like a tumor in their brain or something that's causing that. It always goes back on its own, but you can have it go back to normal and feel better faster with that level of self-awareness. And it's absolutely the double-edged sword. And this gets into a little bit of one of my biggest issues with psychology as a whole and also medicine as a whole is the need. In order for something to be proven effective, you get a gigantic study with thousands of people, test them, do a lot of statistics, and then determine if all of those people combined felt better or felt worse, or, you know, had a heart attack or didn't, or lived to 90 or didn't. And I personally think that those studies need to be, you know, you're comparing that person's progress to themselves only. And when you take a giant statistic and say, like, this helps most people, you don't help anybody, because we're not, like, as a practitioner, I am not looking at 1,000 people and feeling better that it gets better. I'm looking at one person and wanting them to get better. And I think a lot of times, like a small N study, a study that has a few number of participants, is pushed aside as something that it's like, well, that's not enough evidence, that's not proven effective. But in my opinion, proving that like one person got better with this is the only way to prove that something is actually effective for that person, especially in psychology. I can see why in medicine you can do a large N study and that really doesn't affect things. But psychology is very personalized, like we're saying, and it requires that person to think a certain way and, you know, reflect on themselves. And so if we're talking like ego and the way that you perceive yourself, I also think that that's the only way that psychology should be studied, which is very radical, because psychologists love statistics and I do as well. I think it's very interesting. I just don't think it's effective. And I think that's reflected in the, you know, if therapy works or not, and like how effective we are at treating these things. And, you know, for some people, when they get on antidepressants, they get worse. And for other people, they get better. And it's impossible to personalize an approach to treatment without a small N study on those specific people. And, you know, kind of just going all of this, it's a little bit, I'm on my soapbox here, that I love small N studies, but having, like, you do have to admit that everyone is different. Everyone thinks a different way. And we can't look at everyone as a whole and decide, like, yes or no or effective or ineffective. And you do have to look a lot more micro than that with everything.
So yes and yes. Progress looks different for different people. For someone that's in a major depressive episode, getting out of bed to take a shower might be the most they do that day. And at surface level, most people will say, well, that person wasn't very productive. That's why they're still in a depressive disorder. But maybe they haven't been able to get out of bed for 2 days. That is a big step, and it's something that needs to be capitalized on. And well, let me say it this way. I stumbled across it on Instagram, and I forget where it came from, so my apologies for leaving sources out on this. But it was a statement that said sometimes some people can't think their way out of depression, but all people can behave their way out of depression. Right? It's difficult to, especially for the cognitive side, where you're essentializing things. I skipped going to the gym today because I'm tired, because it was a long week, because I'm stressed from all of these other things. A quote unquote normal person, I don't mean normal with any value judgment. I mean normal as in a non-depressed person, right? Would feel fat and lazy the next day and recognize that they feel fat and lazy because they skipped the gym, because they were stressed and they had to spend their time elsewhere, right? Someone that is falling under the cognitive trap of essentialism is going to say, I feel fat and lazy. That's the essential part of my essence and identity. And I don't feel fat and lazy because I skipped the workout. I skipped the workout because I'm fat and lazy. Right. Right. And so we get into those thought traps where sometimes if we just have the gumption and the discipline to go through the acts of doing the things, to clean the room, to go to the gym, we're going to reap the benefits from that cognitively a couple days later, right? If we keep those habits going.
That gets into a little bit like why I like when I look at the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for depression, it makes me laugh, because one of the symptoms is like low appetite and weight loss and not sleeping well at all. And the other symptoms on the same list are weight gain, overeating, and sleeping too much. And like, it's so frustrating because it's so personalized to what it looks like that you can't just make a list of everything that could apply to every person, because weight gain and weight loss and sleeping too much and not sleeping enough are on the same list for the same people. And it's, it's not a disease in the sense that like I can take a picture of you and see that you have like this type, or a picture, an X-ray. There's like diagnostic criteria makes me laugh. Like it's much more global and it's much more personal. And what someone who runs marathons for fun, who is depressed, looks like versus someone who, has never been athletic in their entire life looks depressed is completely different, even though, one person could be suicidal and the other one is like, yeah, I'm having like an 8 out of 10 day, not feeling the best. But you just can't compare in that way. It's so personalized. And it does bother me a little bit, the medicalization of these mental illnesses, because it doesn't apply very well at all. And the same thing with medication. For some people, it throws them into mania. And for some people, it makes them more depressed and makes their anxiety worse. And there's just no one way that it looks, because there's no one way that it's caused, because it's really misunderstood and our brains are like more complicated than the galaxy, so having it you have to do that for like insurance and everything. And like, it's just the way that it fits into our society and the way that we talk about and conceptualize and understand mental illness. And but, I get why we're here, and I still also use the medical terms, but deep down, I'm like, it's not like that. It's not like just like cancer.
Well, and this is why I yesed you earlier. I think that egocentric, and I don't mean that in the colloquial definition of the term, meaning like to have a huge inflated ego and be focused solely on fostering your ego in all your social interactions. I mean egocentric is in like, well, to put simply, that is kindling a relationship with somebody, is getting to understand their ego in the semi-Freudian sense of the term. When I talk about ego and sense of self and identity, again, going back to, I liked your working definition when you used it, your sense of self. That's what I'm talking about when I say ego, is how you, the subjective person, understand yourself enmeshed in your culture and interacting with reality and other people. I know that's kind of the basis for Freud's, but he puts his as like the pivot point between the other parts of your identity, the subconscious and the superconscious, or the unconscious and the collective unconscious, as Jung would put it. And I don't particularly care about that. What interests me is how myself, as the observer of myself, understands myself, because my ego, my understanding of me, is different from me, right? Just at the very least, think about this for a minute, if you dare. Have you ever seen you?
No.
No. You've only ever seen reproductions of what you look like through the screen that we're looking at now, through cameras, through mirrors, through pictures, right? Just to give you an idea of why I'm so weird the way that I am. Like back in late elementary, middle school age, like this was what I had these daydreams about. Like these are the things I would think about. Like, and it makes sense that it happened at that time in life, because that's when you're developing the core of your stable identity, moving forward into maturity. I call them the adolescent formative years. I discovered through COVID that the groups of students that I had coming through had those years interrupted, and they were vastly different in a myriad of ways. That I think developmental psychology has paid too much attention to the formative years of infancy through 4 or 5 years old, and has paid not enough attention, or at least not in the right way, to the adolescent formative years, of where we start. The biological framework of your brain develops during the formative years, and that's wicked important. But how you use it develops in the adolescent formative years, right? When the pruning starts happening. So how you're thinking about yourself really matters a lot. And I would come home from school in like 5th grade or 6th grade and think about like I was on the Truman Show or something like that. Every picture in my house was fabricated. Every mirror was fabricated, right? And there was this, every time I saw me, it didn't feel right. Part of that was because I was going through puberty and everything's awkward at that point. But the other part of it was like, I've never seen me. I've only seen reinterpretations and depictions of that, right?
It sounds like the frustration, or that's the theory of mind, is the point when a child realizes that other people have a perspective as well and have thoughts as well, and that usually happens very young, and that's where empathy comes from. It's like, oh, you're sad too, like having that moment, and it sounds like the frustration of like, I know that they're thinking things, but I'll never know what it really is, and they won't be able to tell me. And like having that realization of the, like, you're locked in, you can't get out from behind your eyeballs,
Mm-hmm.
even though you want to, and it might make things easier if you could. And like the like interest in other people without ever being able to really know, which the like, I use the term egocentrism a lot, and I've over time stopped using that term because it has a pretty bad connotation. It's usually an insult to call someone egocentric, or like an egomaniac. But a lot of times the only thing I mean is that like this person or myself, or, they are not perspective taking deliberately, or if they are perspective taking, they're not going the complete way that they need to perspective taking while still assuming that that other person has all the knowledge that I do. So I think like the classic lecture is like, what color is this book? It's black, but the professor says it's red, and then he turns it around and the other side of the book is red, to kind of teach people the idea of like the theory of mind. And it's at the same time impossible to know whether or not you're doing that correctly, which can get in the way of like communication and understanding and empathy and teaching, saying like, I do have empathy and I still think that they need to XYZ, versus someone who really has taken as many steps as possible to understand where that other person is coming from and then give advice. And, you know, people thinking that they're not being judgmental, but they are, of themselves and of others. And it is almost impossible to tell just by the way that someone is talking about it, whether or not they're doing it correctly. Not that there's like a correct way, but I wouldn't even know if there's a correct way, right?
I mean, I would argue that there is. So I'll circle back to that in a minute. And then I'll come back to this point that I'm trying to make right now in just a second. Because I have a lot of notes and thoughts. I think I want to open that can of worms next time. So let me say my 2 points, and then if you want to respond, you can respond. And then we can schedule the next one and really go into ego as part of the theory of mind. But back to my second point that I was going to say first. The problem that you're pointing to is one that the postmodernists accurately identified in the 1960s and 70s. I think their prescriptions for how to fix it are skewed, but they did, especially with Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, recognizing that there are an infinite number of interpretations. If I write a book, it doesn't matter how many words I use saying this is the point of the book. Every reader is going to come to it from a different perspectival state, right? It's that perspectival knowledge or perspectival knowing that John Vervaeke, cognitive scientist in Toronto, talks about a lot. Multiple different knowledges. You have experiential knowledge, participatory knowledge, perspectival knowledge, and propositional knowledge, right? And because everybody comes to a text from a different perspective, however slightly different, that means their interpretations and their conclusions from the text are probably going to be slightly different. It's also, not to get too mathy here, but it's also in line with Gödel's incompleteness theorem, right? That's kind of that whole, you've never seen yourself, so your sense of self has to, by definition, be generated with incomplete data, right? Same thing. There's just too many damn facts that we're never going to be able to know them all, at least not within one human lifetime, which is part of why history is important, because we can look at the species' collective collection of facts. But it also makes it tricky trying to talk about truth, because what's true? If I write a 6 on the ground and I go and I stand at the top of it, now it looks like a 9, right? So it can be both. What's true? And I think there's a couple different ways that we can say, yes, there is a right way to do things. Part of it is just pragmatism, right? And this is where I do like Aristotle's ethics, the point that he makes that living a good life is doing the right thing at the right time in the right way with the right people for the right reason. He doesn't tell you what right is, right? And I do think that kind of mirrors the approach that you've been talking about of having an ego-centered practitioner's approach, because in this sense, what is doing the right thing is the thing that works to provide evidence of progress in the direction that a client should be going to. Right. And should be can either be from you as the professional's perspective or their perspective. This is something that I'm prepping myself to come to terms with as I start my career in counseling, is sometimes my understanding of what's best for somebody and someone else's understanding of what's best for somebody might be different. And it's not going to be my job to tell people what I think is best for them. It's not going to be my job to lie to people to comfort them either, but to recognize that the way that I live my life and find meaning and value might differ from somebody else's. And as long as I'm helping them find meaning and value in their life, then that's a win, right? The other thing that I think needs to be pointed out, and this kind of ties in with ego here too, is that yes, our cultural conditions shape our understanding of self, the things that we value, the things that we aspire to, and those aspirations as, that barometer for how we feel about ourselves, which is what we can get into next time, why superhero movies work. But I think that a lot of that is based off of human universals, and a lot of those human universals are biologically rooted, right? We do know that there are better and worse ways to live your life. Whether you want to smoke cigarettes or not, you dabble with the risk of lung cancer. It's probably not healthy for you. You're probably not going to be as athletic in your later years as you could be, right? But to say that you shouldn't to a consenting adult because of X, Y, and Z is a bit presumptuous. Whereas, if you have a habit of smoking crack 5 days a week, chances are you're going to have some very severe side effects, very short-term arisal of those, and you're going to create the conditions with which your life will deteriorate, right? We know these things. And we have biometric happiness measurements that we can do. The people live longer when they have lower stress. They have higher value and sense of meaning and fulfillment in community when they have lower stress and lower anxiety. But that necessitates having a communal structure because we're a social species. So if you're enmeshed in a communal structure and you have a community, then you have a place that when you do get stressed, you can easily vent it off, and then you can get support, blah, 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 and all of these markers, right? We know that there is this baseline of human experience that is a better way to do things. But finding a way to translate that to each person's unique ego without losing themselves along the way is where it gets tricky.
I think this does tie in perfectly to history and the way that we are able to think about people of the past, because I was just thinking about how the way that the risks of smoking are communicated is saying if they had quit smoking, then they wouldn't have got lung cancer. And technically it's still not proven that lung cancer comes from smoking, because tons of people smoke their entire life and never get it. So there is no causation. There's only the correlation, and that's what we use to make these decisions, which works pretty well. But you cannot say that's why that particular person got lung cancer, and if they had stopped smoking, it wouldn't have happened. And there are some people who smoke only 5 years and they do get lung cancer 30 years down the line. And I think if you had done this in the past, then this wouldn't have happened is the wrong approach, because it's not helpful and it doesn't matter. And that's what we think about with history as well, was well, if they had done this, then this wouldn't have happened, or because they did this, then this happened. And you're not able to have a clear causation about any of that, but it's our tendency to, think very simply and have those heuristics of this is why this happened, and I can say for sure I understand it. And it's easier, especially when thinking about tragedies and things, seeing someone very, very ill and saying, well, I do this and that's why I'm not going to get it. and they did this and that's why they got it. And you're able to separate yourselves from this truly random human experience that you can never say, like, I exercise and I eat right, so I'm never going to get lung cancer. You can tell yourself that, and it's comforting, but it's not true. And it's also harmful to, think about disease in that way, because you're blaming the person who got sick for what happened. And it's, the better focus is to say, like, today, right now, what are you doing? Like, saying if this, then this doesn't help. It's not true. And it can be detrimental to the people who are like, then this, who are sick, who are, didn't put their seatbelt on, that type of thing. But it's also a really effective way to communicate and like change behaviors, to tell people, the scary thing could happen to you. And I think, like, putting your mind in the past, putting your mind where, oh, they could have changed this here, and thinking about, putting yourself in that situation, having that sometimes real theory of mind, sometimes fake pseudo theory of mind, where you're not actually really empathizing with this person, it happens all the time. And I think you see it where people say, like, oh, if they had just eaten right, then they wouldn't have got cancer. And you don't know that. You can't say that. So I don't know, there's not a conclusion to that thought, really. I think it happens a lot, and I think it's a tendency of people to do. And being aware of that tendency, I think, is important, not to jump to thinking that you fully understand a situation, even when, it's clear. It's the Roman Empire. We know why it fell. But you can't say that's why it fell.
Well, and I think a lot of that is because heuristics are essential.
Yeah.
I'm finding in my thought exercises and my thinkings and my writings that, it's like every great scientist or every great philosopher has like that one quirk that they never get away from. All of their talkings always come back to that one point, right? For Einstein, it was E equals mc squared. It's how we remember it anyway. But, theories of light and particle physics, for Hegel, it was the dialectic, etc. I think mine's the heuristic. The fact that everything's a heuristic. I think human beings are a heuristic for consciousness. I think our ego is a heuristic for interfacing with reality as a first-person observer rather than a third-person observer, right? And the more I think about it, the more I come back to everything hinges on heuristics in some capacity, which we can explore next time, because I got to go put kids in bed. Ego, theory of mind, balloons. Thank you, Skype.
I think awareness, because to me, knowing that you view the world through heuristics is more important than actually viewing the world through heuristics, right? Like, there's no one right way to do it, but being aware that you do it is the most important part.
Yes. And also when to apply them and when to not.
Right.
Right. Because we can talk about attention as a moral act and consciousness as a heuristic within the frame of the ego next time too. Yeah, I think we need a part 2.
Sounds great.
Any last words?
No.
No, I think
I tried to think of famous last words off the top of my head and nothing came up.
My favorite last word story is there was, I think he was French. He was a French duke or something like that. He got sentenced to death, and he pointed out the various mistakes in grammar and spelling in his execution sentence. It's like,
way to go
right. I strive to be so petty one day.
Yeah. He died the way he lived. Petty.
Well, it's like the meme of, the devil says, "Welcome to hell," and it's this full of lava. It's like, well, we're underground, so actually it's magma. And he's like, that's why you're here, right?
Yeah. Yep. All right. Good last words.